Trigger warning. Viewing the following content may cause intellectual strain and swelling of logical capacity. If you suffer from perpetual rectal discomfort, viewer discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Conversations from X to Z. Thank you for joining us today. Today's topic that we will be discussing will be Generation Z and their concerns about climate change. Apparently, that's a biggie on their list of things that matter to them, and we're going to discuss exactly what it is that they find to be so concerning and how it affects them and what possible things can be done to alleviate some of those concerns. And we're going to have this discussion between myself, my name is Anthony, and my son, his name is Jeremiah. And hopefully you'll find this conversation interesting and perhaps you may even learn something. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be right back.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we will be talking about climate change. I'm going to be explaining Gen Z's view on it. I've done some research, I've done some digging, and I have a pretty good idea of how they look at it. I don't share Gen Z's views on this specific subject, nor do I share their views on a lot of other stuff, but I am, I guess, representing Gen Z, and I am part of Gen Z, and I have looked into it a bit. And as far as climate change goes, it seems like they are very passionate about it, and it's something they really care for. It seems like, preserving the earth and helping the environment is a really big thing for them. And with that being said, it's a good thing. That sounds like a good thing, but it also can be a bad thing when they care a little too much about it. They might become obsessed with it and might have some other issues. So I'm going to bring up an article here that kind of talks a little bit about the effects or how Gen Z views climate change and just how much it affects them. It says, for Gen Z, climate change is a heavy emotional burden. So, they feel as though that it is a really strong subject and it is an important thing. It is a important thing to them. And the article says, people who have come of age in recent decades, millennials and members of Generation Z, have been exposed to a steady stream of alarming news about climate change and ecological destruction. And growing body of evidence suggests that these worsening problems and the failure to address them are taking an emotional toll. And I think that makes a lot of sense because, why wouldn't it take an emotional toll on them? They've been growing up with this, hearing the bad news and the bad effects of climate change, and with a view that it's a really bad problem, then yes, it absolutely would take an emotion on them. And I believe that the reason why they're so passionate about it is because of the image that they have been given out from the news and the left and the agenda that's been pushed towards them. A lot of large leftist news organizations like CNN or NBC push climate change very often and as a very important thing that is horrible for the environment. And I feel like with Gen Z getting all these images that it is the worst thing ever, it's definitely going to worry them. I have another thing from the Washington Post, and it says, "World is on brink of catastrophic warming," UN climate change report says. And the title right there is obviously scary, but then at the bottom it says, "A dangerous climate threshold is near, but it does not mean we are doomed if we take action, or if swift action is taken," scientists say. So it's the wording they use specifically go after to kind of intimidate people or make people more interested and concerned about it. It says it does not mean we are doomed right there, but at the top it says, world is on brink of catastrophic warming. So I feel like yes, they've been given a somewhat biased view towards the topic, and it's it's kind of disappointing because they look at this like a really important thing, and to them, it absolutely probably is. But because everything that they've been shown is just bad and a really big concern, I feel like their view is a little skewed. I have a another site here from NASA, and it says a degree of concern why global temperatures matter. Now, I'm not going to read the whole article. This portion of the article just talks about the sea turtles and how they're being affected from the temperature rising. again, if you guys would like to look at the articles yourselves, we post them in the description if you want to look at them and you want to see what they have to say. But what this talks about is pretty much it gives us some examples of how climate change affects the world, the actual effects it has and what happens. And all these effects are, crazy and extreme. Now, it's not being said that they're not happening, but there's no way they're happening to these extents because they make it seem like it is the absolutely worst thing ever, and that climate change and the effect it has on the world is horrible. And they talk about food shortages, for example. And I feel like that because of these are the examples that Gen Z has been given that climate change affects the world. They are thinking it's the worst thing ever. And I feel like since they've grown up with that idea that it is so bad and, climate change hasn't stopped, then I feel like they've become very nervous and, scared about it. And I feel like it could definitely, affect their mental health. There's another article that I would like to show from the National Institute of Health. And in the article from the American Psychological Association, they come up and they call this eco anxiety. And it basically is a mental health issue that comes from worry of the environment, and the effects of it are a chronic fear of environmental doom ranging from mild stress to clinical disorders like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicide, and maladaptive coping strategies such as intimate partner violence and substance misuse.
Let me interject there for a moment. Couple things real quick on that subject. One, it makes perfect sense, right? If you grew up your whole life hearing that things are catastrophic and the world's going to end, that you would end up having a much higher likelihood of developing anxiety.
Yeah.
But I think it's tragic and super depressing as an adult, as a person who's of a different generation, to see how this kind of exposure has led to these kinds of symptoms being manifested in people. The idea that somebody is so focused on the climate that they would end up beating their spouse or doing drugs
Yeah.
or thinking about killing themselves or suffering from post traumatic stress disorder
Yeah.
as if they went to some sort of war. I I don't know how to wrap my brain around that. How
Yeah.
someone can obsess so deeply on something that hasn't actually manifested yet. And it's sad. It's that's the only thing that I think I can really just say in full is it's just sad. It's so sad.
So yeah, I agree with that because I do believe that yes, it is a concern and it is sad and somewhat tragic to see that because I feel as though first off, nobody is arguing climate change is not happening. I feel like everybody understands that yes, climate change is absolutely a thing and it is absolutely occurring, but I don't think it is occurring at the rates that they make it out to be. And I feel like to develop these kind of disorders and have these kind of effects over something like that is concerning, and I feel like that's the main problem. The real problem is they are looking at this and they're practically crumbling over this because it stresses them out and it scares them that much, and that's the worrying part of it. I feel like it also I have done some research, and from what it seems, it affects them in their daily lives. I have an article from CNBC, and this article talks about how Gen Z is impacted by climate change and what it does to their mental health. It says the climate crisis impacts everyone, and young people feel especially stressed about the warming planet. In 2021, a global study of 10,000 young people found 45% of those between the ages of 16 and 25 said climate anxiety was affecting their daily lives. And both the United Nations and the American Psychological Association says humans are increasingly at risk of climate change-induced mental health issues. And that is, you know, definitely a concern because if they can be developing mental health issues due to the climate changing and due to climate change as a whole, that's a concern because it's not something that you should be able to develop a mental health issue due to. It's not that big of a concern, in my opinion. I don't think, and I don't think that any other generations have seen stuff like this.
Let me just ask you a quick question. I didn't think of this before, but
Yeah.
um, notice the wording, right? Even this article, which is trying to kind of be informative,
Yeah.
even they're using language to try to incite this. Where it says, the UN and American Psychological Association says humans are increasingly at risk of climate change induced mental health issues, as
Hmm.
if climate change is what's causing these mental health issues.
Yeah.
There's no accountability there that says it's the way that we as a media cover climate change,
Hmm.
or the way the government speaks of like there's nothing there that says, hey, we have a part in causing this
Yeah.
kind of mental change. So I just wanted to point that out real quick. It
Yeah.
literally just hit me that when I saw that.
Yeah. And, before we have people saying, like, oh, the climate change can cause mental health issues, we're not claiming that if a hurricane comes and rips your house from the inside out and you start freaking out about it and you can't get over that, we are not saying that that's not something to, fear or be worried about. We're simply saying that when you turn on the news and the news is claiming, the water rose 4 inches or the temperature spiked by 0.2 degrees, that's what we're saying is ridiculous to develop these mental health issues. And to let it interfere on your judgment, or I believe is the correct term for saying, it's a little bit ridiculous, especially when it comes to big life changing decisions, such as trying to find a job. I have an article as well from CNBC that says Gen Z grew up with climate change and now it's starting to have an effect on their career choices. What this article talks about is Gen Z and their worry of climate change and how it affects them trying to find the job. Um, I'll read some of the article right here. It says Gen Z grew up with climate change as a known factor in life, one that takes on an increasing sense of urgency every day. As fires rage through the West and hurricane strikes the Southeast, the drumbeat is getting louder and it's starting to have an impact on their career choices. Even prior to the pandemic and devastating wildfires of 2020, 4 out of 10 young people identified climate change as one of the most significant issues facing the planet. Gen Z is uniquely positioned in part because for many, they cannot recall a time when climate change was not a topic of discussion. And again, if you guys would like to read the articles, we put them in the description. But what the article claims is that largely what it is a term they call greenwashing. It is when a company acts as though it is environmentally friendly and it helps preserve the environment and help the environment when they're not as green as they claim to be. And Gen Z are looking at that and saying, I don't want to work for this company or I don't want to work for these people because they don't share the same values that I have. And in some scenarios, if a company doesn't share your values, then if you feel the need that you shouldn't work there for that reason, that's okay. But to let something like climate change make it out to be like a religious belief almost, and let it, you know, infringe on your thoughts, it's a little ridiculous, especially when it comes to getting a job. So yeah, and it's not even just getting a job. It's other things like having a child, for example. Have a article from the Washington Post that says, should you not have kids because of climate change? It's complicated. What this talks about is people who are deciding not to have kids because scientists claim that the less kids there are, the more it will reduce carbon emissions, which might be true. But at the same time, it is an absurd idea, I guess, to let something like that kind of influence your decision on having a kid. And it's not just this article. I have an article from The Guardian that says want to fight climate change, have fewer children. I have another one from NBC News that says science proves kids are bad for Earth. Morality suggests we should stop having them. So I feel like Gen Z has taken climate change and they have pretty much sent it to the extreme where they let it, influence their thoughts on where they want to work or what careers they want to have or whether or not they want to have a child. And I believe that it is, kind of absurd and it's worrying because as we see, this affects their mental health as well. And they have kind of just been put in this position. It's not like they asked for it. But at the same time, there's only so much we can do to kind of say like you guys are wrong, you guys are right, without necessarily making them back up and say, straight up you're wrong, even though we might have scientific evidence to prove otherwise. Nonetheless, it's just something that I feel like people really need to do some research on. I feel like Gen Z has a bit of a skewed view because they've been fed so much of one-sided opinion that not many of them have actually looked into the topic and looked into how climate change affects the earth and what real effects it has and how it works. I feel like they all think climate change is a bad and completely negative thing, and they all assume that it is going to lead to the worst. As we'll talk about later in the video, scientists kind of just come out and say, in like 30, 20 years, the world's pretty much going to end. And I feel like because of that, Gen Z is viewed as kind of skewed and messed up on climate change. And if we kind of back up from the extremes of, our predictions, and we actually let them learn about it, if we actually told them about it, I feel like they would kind of catch on. But that's pretty much how I've seen them view climate change, and that's what I think their thoughts are on it.
I can see that you put some time into trying to understand where they're coming from. I think, like many things, the answers aren't always so clear, especially when it comes to the subjects that have such a wide-ranging impact on not just one group of people, but all of humanity as a whole. I think Gen Z is known to be particularly susceptible to emotional manipulation, and the reason why I say that, I'm going to go ahead and share a document here from Psychology Today. It's entitled, "Are Gen Zers Too in Touch with Their Feelings?" Um, this article goes through many of the concepts of how people are basically oriented towards their emotion. People of Gen Z and millennial persuasion, and that there's a very notable pattern that that emotional orientation supersedes um, the logical in many ways. And here we could see one example they give is that if the self-esteem movement worked, we would expect to see a much greater tendency in our just now becoming adult population toward making decisions based on feeling rather than on thinking. Being overly in touch with feelings at the expense of thinking could account for why Gen Zers often report feeling overwhelmed by their problems to a greater extent than previous generations. Now, you had brought up that this is definitely a concern for Gen Z, and you also brought up that it it has kind of extended, uh, in some cases, beyond a concern to a greater problem. I think when we talk about subjects like this, it's important to understand what data is available that can be referenced, how accurate is that data, the validity of the conclusions that can be made on that data, and whether or not that information is actually useful. Here we have a Pew Research Center. They did a survey. It was done by the American Trends Panel, and it was entitled "Gen Z Millennials Stand Out for Climate Change Activism: Social Media Engagement with the Issues." And I think it's kind of interesting, right? Because they surveyed 13,749 total panelists. Um, that ranged in ages. I think the thing that stood out to me is that there were incentives given to the people who participated. All respondents were offered a post-paid incentive for their participation. It took the form of um, an Amazon promo code or gift card. Ranged anywhere from $5 to $20. That's not a lot, right? But it was designed to motivate people to participate, and the higher dollar amount was for people who were often more difficult to reach and to get to participate in studies. Uh, what I also found interesting is that they have an ongoing incentive program to get people to participate, and they go on to state that typically panel members are assigned no more than one survey per week. On average, panel members complete 2 to 3 surveys per month. Now, if they keep asking the same people questions over and over again, I'm not exactly sure how representative that is of the general public as a whole. How much weight can be given to that data derived from that group. The weighting of the models that they use and the people that they survey, it's kind of difficult to understand exactly how they choose these people. But in the end, you got to go with whatever data is available and try to make some kind of understanding from that. Basically, this document summed up something that kind of pretty much laid it out clearly. They were asking questions of Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, and boomers. And I'm showing here some of the questions asked were climate should be top priority to ensure sustainable planet for future generations. And they break down what percentage of each group supports that. And it's a 67% Gen Z, 71% millennials, 63% Gen X, and 57% boomers. Addressing climate change is my top personal concern. 37, 33, 27, 29. Have personally taken action to help address climate change within the last year. 32, 28, 23, 21. And then they kind of gave a different category where in the past few weeks, specifically, have you talked about need for action on climate at least 1 to 2 times? Gen Z is 67%, millennials 61%, Gen X 53%, boomers 50%. Seen content on social media about need for climate action, 56, 46, 42, 44. Engaged on social media with content on need for climate action, 45, 40, 27, 21. Now, the one thing that all of these have in common is that the percentage of Gen Z and millennials that engage with these issues and have strong opinions is higher than Gen X and boomers. Now, what assumptions can be made off of this information? Some people would take this to mean that, the older generations just don't care as much, or they're not interested, they're not worried about what's going to happen, which I think is kind of laughable and stupid because, I have children. There's grandchildren. We as loving parents want our children to be able to grow up and have their own children. So to kind of suggest that just because you're in an older generation that you don't care is it's kind of asinine. I think it's disingenuous and it just it kind of betrays a little bit of ideological bias, right? Because it shows that, well, if you don't agree with me 100%, then obviously you're a bad person, right? It's not that we can look at the same data and reach different conclusions. No, that can't possibly be it. It's not that I'm looking at this and I'm making an emotional conclusion, and you're looking at this and you're making a logical conclusion. No. You're just a bad person. So I think that kind of mentality is very prevalent, and it really makes honest conversation about this kind of stuff difficult, and especially with Gen Z. You've got young people who are clearly geared towards an emotional reaction, and when you try to have logical conversations, more often than not, they don't want to hear it because it's almost to the point where it's a religious belief, and I try to show data to kind of open eyes as much as possible, whenever possible, because I think it's important that if you're going to believe in something strongly and you're going to defend a position, that what you believe in and what you're defending should be verified. It should be the truth. And the one thing that I always notice when people refer to data is they usually omit certain details, right? And I'm going to show another page here in regards to this kind of survey study thing. And you know, it's the margin of error. Now, what I find ironic is that their totals, right? They give totals for U.S. adults at 13,749, and they give the total margin of error at plus or minus 1.4 points. However, if you look in their breakdowns, the biggest margin of error is plus or minus 8.8 points, and that spreads between 8.8 and 1.9, and you got a couple of twos in there, some fours, some threes, some fives. Like, clearly this is not as accurate as they would like you to believe that it is. And I think that there's not enough people that understand that this kind of data is super subjective. First of all, these people are self-selecting to participate. They're invited, but they're the ones that choose to participate. So chances are they have some kind of motivation to do so. Perhaps it's the financial incentive, which honestly, $20, seriously, like, maybe that's it, but who knows? I think it's more likely that they have an ideological motivation to participate. And unfortunately, I think younger generations just
More susceptible to it.
are more susceptible to it, And here's something that I'm going to ask you. Because younger people are more prone to emotion and less prone to reasoning out their positions. Can you think of, and this isn't a test, it's just off the top of your head. Can you think of some choices um, that they might make, some decisions in life that they might be willing to support outside of what you'd already mentioned, which is, job choices and
Yeah.
children, where their concerns about climate change might affect the things that they decide to do?
Well, I think in their daily lives, I take a cyclist, for example, people who ride a bike instead of using a car. I feel like that's a good example, because a lot of people who do it, for the most part, especially nowadays, aren't doing it because they don't have the money for a car. They're doing it because, it's good for the environment and they want to help keep the environment clean and healthy. I feel like another thing with the emotional side is in doing that and doing that act of helping the environment, it also makes them feel good about themselves. It makes them feel like they're contributing and like they're helping a good cause. And I feel like that is a really big thing that, people fall into because if hypothetically, because I'm not saying the people who do it are evil, but if you are doing something bad, but you feel like you're doing something good and you don't know it, you're gonna keep doing because you're gonna get that, giddy feeling inside, like, oh, I did something good. I'm happy about that. And I feel like that's what it is. They do these things that, people recommend, like using a bike instead of a car, or getting an electric car instead of a gas powered car. And it makes them feel good and it makes them be like, yeah, I'm contributing. And green, I feel like another thing is like solar panels in people's houses. So yeah, I feel like it's really not that hard because they just kind of got to get you to feel like you're doing something good and take out as little as they can go to the furthest extent of you not basically giving up your freedom, and they got you. They'll be willing to do it.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned cars, right? Because that survey that we were talking about, right? It specifically references younger generations more willing than older to give up fossil fuels and phase out gas powered cars. And it shows the same trend where Gen Z and millennials are clearly skewing higher. Um, In the prioritize alternative energy development, Gen Z 76%, Millennial 81%, Gen X 72, Boomers 63. Phase out fossil fuels, Gen Z 43, Millennials 42, Gen X 32, Boomers 25. Phase out gas powered vehicles, Gen Z 56, Millennials 57, Gen X 45, Boomers 38, right? And then no more oil and gas drilling, similar kind of numbers. Now, here's the problem that I see with that, right? Like it's not inherently bad to want to have an impact, right?
Yeah.
It's not inherently bad to think that if I make a sacrifice that I'm going to be improving, the lives of not just myself but of those around us. And that's the emotional perspective, right? But here's the lack of thought that goes into these positions. All right. First of all, clearly these people are talking about, you know, the environmental impact of gasoline powered vehicles, yet it seems that none of them have thought about the environmental impact of lithium mining.
Yeah.
Lithium is needed to create the batteries for all of these electric vehicles, right? Um, Not only that, but clearly not enough thought has been given to the power grid in terms of its capacity to actually power all of these things. Our electric grid, as it stands now in the United States, is just about able to keep up with what's being done. And here's the dirty little secret about wind and solar. The way an energy grid functions, any plant that comes online is on demand. Okay, what that means is um, they must be able to produce whatever their stated power capacity is on demand. In other words, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Um, as we all know, it's the wind does not always blow, and the sun does not always shine. So not only are these people calling for the removal of gas powered cars, which has caused the price of lithium to go up. I'm not sure what the actual number is. I believe it's like 300%. It's 3 times more expensive, right?
Yeah.
But now we need to come up with storage solutions for all of this renewable energy that's produced when it's available so that it can be distributed when it's not available. Because currently, and this is what they don't know, they push all of these things, but what they're not aware of is every single one of these facilities that has wind, that has solar, also has to have a fossil fuel burning backup.
Yeah.
Because if there's not sufficient wind or if there's not enough sunlight,
Yeah.
they must be able to provide whatever their rated capacity is. So they have to use, usually it's natural gas burning
Yeah.
generators. So that right there kind of shows that there's a lack of depth of thought
Yeah.
on the consequences, right? But then you go even further. Um, there's many different aspects where this changes things in terms of the individual, right? But there's also the concern about freedom. You know, the automobile allows you as an individual the autonomy to decide to go where you want, when you want. You are not dependent on someone else to travel. You can decide to take a trip and you get in your car, you go get your fuel, and you go. Now, electric vehicles, um, to a certain extent, um, you have a real hard time doing that right now. Right? That's largely due to lack of infrastructure.
Yeah.
Um, what they also don't say is that electric vehicles um, I'm not sure that they're ever going to um, be genuinely affordable, right? So you're excluding a huge part of the population of the world, right? Because generally speaking, poor
Hmm.
people who are actually poor, they can't afford $50,000 cars,
Yeah.
right? So you're basically saying, um, screw you. We don't care about your freedom. You're just a pawn in our social engineering, and you're going to just have to live with whatever system we create. And if you don't like it, tough. So you better get used to riding a bus, and you better get used to trains. And if you live somewhere where those things don't exist,
Mhm.
you're gonna have to hoof it, or you're gonna have to ride a bike. So for your generation, I think that kind of understanding doesn't really register that much. But I can understand, and I like you mentioned, you brought up several examples of how your generation has kind of been hypersensitized to climate change. Like that NASA thing that you showed. There must have been, I don't know, 15 different things on there of the catastrophic, world-ending, calamitous.
Yeah.
And here's the problem, right? And I think this is what your generation needs to understand. I don't think anybody disputes, or not anybody serious
Yeah.
disputes, that the climate is changing,
Yeah. Absolutely.
right? Because from the beginning of time, the climate has always changed.
Mhm.
There's never been a constant temperature on this planet or any other planet. First of all, the position of the planet from the sun in its orbit changes the temperature. Thus, we have seasons. Wow, like I didn't think that was something that would need to be explained, but yeah, some people apparently don't understand that. Um, More so than that, you know, the reality of the situation that we face is the reason why there's a large pushback by some people against climate change is because of the emotional reactions that have caused people to well to lie. There's no other way to put it. When you're having a hyper emotional nervous breakdown, you tend to be hysterical about whatever you're talking.
Yeah.
And there's where you end up with, oh, the world's gonna end. Like if we don't do something right now.
Yeah.
Al Gore came out with his inconvenient truth, but absolutely nothing of what he said in that movie actually happened. That's one example. I'm going to show here another example. Uh, this is in Forbes magazine, right? There's top 10 global warming lies that shock you, right? So they've got a list here of a bunch of different assertions, um, and how they kind of they fact check it and demonstrate that these are all just patently false. Um, the New York Post also has an article here. Um, 50 years of predictions that the climate apocalypse is nigh. And this one does I think a little better job of actually putting it into pictures, right? So in 1972, the United Nations Environmental Protection Boss warns we have 10 years to stop the catastrophe. Right now, this is documented in this article. Again, in 1982, uh, Tulba, which was the head of the UN Environmental Program, is quoted that if the nations of the world, well, he's not quoted, but it's paraphrased, and then there's a direct quote. If the nations of the world continue their current policies, they will face by the year 2000, and here's the quote, an environmental catastrophe as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust. Imagine a big mushroom cloud and the world on fire. In 1989, a senior UN environmental official tells the Associated Press, we have to fix climate change by 1999, right? Another 10-year prediction, or climate change goes beyond human control. And here's the quote: global disaster, nations wiped off the face of the earth, crop failures. These are, again, last time I checked, 1999 came and went, and none of that happened.
Yeah, right.
1990, again with Mustafa Talba, head of the United Nations Environmental Program. We must to fix climate change before 1995. So now we went from a 10-year window to 5 years. We shall win or lose the climate struggle in the first years of the 1990s. Right? Then, you have the Pentagon getting in on the act. It's crazy. It's crazy, right? In 2004, the Pentagon was telling the Bush administration that climate change will destroy us all. 2007, Rajendra Patrai, head of the UN Climate Panel. What we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine our future. If there is no action before 2012, that's too late.
Maybe they were on about the Mayan calendar or something.
And then in 2019, again, the United Nations, only 11 years left to prevent irreversible damage from climate change. Okay, you see, this is the issue, right? I think reasonable, level-headed people can understand clearly that human activity has to have some kind of impact, right? Because we're pumping out chemicals and gases into the atmosphere. Obviously, there's some reaction, right? It's a basic scientific law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So something's happening. Now, from the scientific perspective, I think there's a kind of a presupposition in the studies that says it's bad. It's always bad. There's never a positive. It has to be bad.
It's like they want the world to end.
That's a good question, and then you have to ask yourself, if you have that suspicion, then the question is why.
Yeah, it's
but
like,
that's a separate subject. Like we can go off on that tangent for 3 or 4 hours talking about that. But I do very much believe, and I think if you take the time, look at it, I think it's pretty clear that when you hear things like the scientific consensus says that this is the truth, like I recall that there was a time in history when the scientific consensus said that the world was flat, and anyone who believed otherwise was ridiculed and mocked and was called a science denier and this, that, and the other. And I think things have gone a little bit further in that genuine scientific inquiry seems to be dying, because people are now coming up with conclusions and then doing experiments to verify their conclusions, instead of doing experiments to determine the truth and then reach a conclusion. And if anybody were to doubt that, ask a university professor, what are the chances of getting funding for a study that's objective about the climate, that doesn't presuppose that the climate is suffering. And the reality is that it's virtually impossible to get funding at the university level to do an honest study. It doesn't happen. There's such a skew towards one direction, and when you hear things like the science is settled, these are not scientific terms. There is no such thing as the science is settled. Uh, the science is settled until it's not, and that's the way science works. There is no such thing as settled. Is a new discovery changes all previous understanding, and right now there's no genuine inquiry, so we don't actually know what the real consequences are going to be. we have predictions of what can happen,
Hmm.
right? But those predictions are based on computer models, right? So, what are those computer models formulated with?
And how can we trust the models when all their predictions, there's something they all have in common. One, they're all horrible, and two, they've pretty much all been wrong.
There's quite a few that have been wrong. There's been a handful that have actually been accurate, and the ones that have been accurate have all been at the lower end of the scale.
Yeah.
All of the models have all had a range in the prediction from what would be considered a conservative estimate to what could be considered a worst case catastrophic scenario. So there's quite a bit of spectrum there in predicted outcomes. But in reality, everything that's come to pass that's actually happened has all been on the small side. It's all
Yeah.
been minor, and I I got into a conversation with a guy, and basically the only thing he could point to was there was a prediction done about the Maldives, and yeah, I think when it was all said and done, the sea level rose by like 4 inches, if I recall correctly. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but it's like, oh my god, and
Yeah.
I think for your generation, the thing that you guys need to remember, and if I, as a man and a father, were to give advice to someone your age, um, put things into perspective and verify for yourself what you can. Um, and I think the old adage that has been around for a long, long time is probably good. Um, Trust nothing of what you hear and only half of what you see, because everything is produced now with an intent. Finding something neutral is very, very difficult. So I think especially for people who are susceptible to emotional manipulation, you have to guard yourself as much as you can from the sources of information that you're willing to expose yourself to, and realize that just because you hear it from one place, um, that doesn't mean it's true. And sometimes even the people that you come to trust can betray that trust.
Yeah.
So try to verify whatever it is that you choose to believe. Um, do the best you can to find out, you know, the information that's available. Uh, Put whatever effort you can to verify that that information is as accurate as possible, that it's as unbiased as possible within human limitations. But at the end of the day, you know, there's only so much you can do. There's only so much you can do as an individual. And when it comes to the climate, it doesn't really matter what the United States does. China and India are not going to stop pumping out greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
I think the last thing I heard was China puts up a new coal plant like every day. It's some crazy number, man. So yeah, it's it's almost pointless to have this conversation. But for people who feel that emotional pull and that eco anxiety, like you referenced, sure, I can totally see how this can dominate their life and make them feel like oh, what do I do? But to be quite honest with you, I want to be on record. I fully support anyone who decides not to have a child
Yeah.
because they're concerned for the environment. I think that's an excellent idea. Um, I encourage them to make that decision. One, it's their right as
Hmm.
as a human being, right? Because you have the right to choose whether or not to procreate. Two, I think it's a net benefit for society uh, for two reasons. One, the so-called environmental impact of not having a child, right? And two is they are willfully and voluntarily removing their genes from the gene pool, and I think that is a wonderful idea because eventually that will lead to less of this kind of emotional stupidity. So, with that said, I just want to let the people know my name's Anthony, and I really appreciate you joining us for this conversation. I hope you found it informational, and
My name's Jeremiah, and thank you guys for again. comment down any concerns you have, or if you may disagree with anything we said. We're interested to see what you guys have to say. And if you want to continue watching us, subscribe or follow us on Rumble. And thank you for the view.